Welcome to the Transforming Trauma podcast. Transforming Trauma is presented by the NARM Training Institute. I'm your host, Emily Ruth, and I'm so glad you've joined us today. Hi, Transforming Trauma listeners. Do you want to join the international NARM community in support of trauma-informed care? If so, please consider joining us to become trained in the neuroaffective relational model. We are excited to offer 2 starting levels of professional trainings designed to support those of you working with clients or populations dealing with the effects of adverse childhood experiences and complex trauma. The Level 1 online NARM Basics training is a psychoeducational training designed for helping professionals in a variety of fields, such as mental health professionals, substance abuse counselors, educators, doctors, nurses, other healthcare providers, coaches, and more. The Level 2 NARM Therapist training is a comprehensive clinical training designed for licensed mental health professionals, as well as current mental health graduate students and clinical interns and trainees. For more information on these NARM trainings and to apply, please visit www.narmtraining.com/schedule. And now for our episode. This year has brought many thought-provoking conversations to the podcast. The team here at Transforming Trauma is grateful to the guests and for you, our listener, for joining us on our mission to transform trauma. In this year-end episode, Brad Kammer and I reflect on podcast highlights from 2023 and explore some memorable moments. We hope you enjoy this conversation with NARM Training Director Brad Kammer. All right, I'm sitting here with Brad Kammer. We're going to take this episode to just review some of the highlights of our podcast this year. Welcome, Brad.
Yeah, thank you, Emily. Really happy to be here. I enjoy doing this with you. We've done this for the last couple of years, so looking forward to this.
Well, let's dive in. I don't know where you want to start.
Well, I'd love to start with you. Just, you're the one who does most of these interviews, and you've gotten to meet all these really interesting people in 2023. And just maybe we can start with what kind of has stood out, what has landed for you, what's impacted you, and we can kind of go from there.
Yeah, I love that. Gosh, there's so many. And we started to talk about them before we pressed record. And I'll just say, Brad wanted the surprise. So there's so many that floated to the top for me. It's hard to, name all of them. But the first one that came up for me was with Belle Shook. She did the equine therapy episode. And I was really lucky. I don't live far from Belle. I live just a couple hours. So she invited me up to her ranch and actually got to experience in person the horses. And it was a really beautiful experience. And, seeing how she integrates NARM into the work that she does was really, really powerful for me.
Did you go visit her after you interviewed her or before?
No, before.
Oh,
Yeah, she
interesting.
wanted me to get a taste of what her work was like, it felt really good to do that. So then when we talked, I had a little bit more of the context and understanding, experientially what she was talking about.
Oh, that's great. So you had that embodied kind of experience with it. And did you recognize some of the NARM principles or skills she was bringing in?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. There was a spaciousness, and I had done a little bit of work with horses once before, and it felt very different to me. In fact, almost to the point where I almost forgot that I had done it.
Wow.
Yeah, because it felt really, there was something very different, a different kind of quality, a spaciousness. That's kind of the word that kept coming up for me. And she just has a really lovely way about her voice and everything. The whole experience was really sweet.
I know there's a lot of people who have been trained in NARM, or I don't know about a lot, but there's definitely been people that have been trained in NARM that work with animals, horses. And I'm always interested in the integration of it. So it's cool that you got that direct experience. And I hope I'll be able to get that at some point too.
I'm sure she'd love to have you down at the
Yeah.
ranch in Sedona.
We work with a residential treatment center for adolescent girls out of Utah called Roots Transition. And one of their equine therapists, who also is their family therapist, came through our training. She was actually in your master's training this year, Eliza. And yeah, so I've heard some cool stories also from them about how they're integrating it with adolescent girls and their families. And it's just so exciting to hear the integration of these kind of trauma-informed models like NARM.
Yeah, that's really exciting. So yeah, Belle Shook, that was a really cool experience. How about you? What comes to the top for you?
Well, I've had a couple of my kind of dream guests this year. When we started the podcast, what was it, 2020? I'm not sure now, but I had a small list of kind of dream guests. Some are like more famous people, like celebrities like Oprah and stuff, which we haven't been able to get her yet. Alanis Morissette, some folks like that. And then there was also people just within our field that were kind of some of my dream guests. And we got two of them this year. So one was Dr. Judith Herman, which you had a wonderful conversation with her. And I can imagine if I was in your shoes during that interview, I would have had a lot of different feelings
Yeah.
because, I got introduced to her in graduate school, almost 25 years ago. And she's impacted just even people that don't know her name now have been impacted so significantly by her work because she was one of the first, before there was a Bessel van der Kolk or a Brene Brown, it was Judith Herman that was
Mhm.
really putting this on the map. And her book, Trauma and Recovery, is really, I believe, a must read for anyone in the trauma field. So listening to that interview with you and her was just wonderful. And I didn't even know she came out with a new book. So it was cool to hear about her new book. And
Mhm.
what are your memories about that
Oh
conversation?
my gosh. Yeah, it was a total pinch me moment. I mean, it was
Mhm.
just amazing. And she was so warm and gosh, everything, one would hope. Her book was literally the first one in grad school that they like required me to buy. So she was a little, really my introduction really to all of this. And so, yeah, that conversation really impacted me. And that's pretty much all I can say about it. It was pretty big for me. Yeah.
Yeah. And then the other kind of dream guest was Jonathan Shedler.
Mhm.
I think Emily knows some of the story, but I'll tell the listeners the story. I've been following his work on social media for a while now. He has a very active Twitter account where he is just very courageous, I believe, in our field. He's a very fierce advocate for long-term depth-oriented psychotherapy and is a pretty strong critic against short-term quote evidence-based approaches. He's done some really important research that demonstrates the long-term significance of long-term therapy and psychodynamic-based therapy, depth-oriented therapy, and also, criticizing some of the shorter-term models. So I've just enjoyed his work. He writes about a lot of different things. He writes about personality dynamics, obviously trauma, and he wasn't interested in coming on to our podcast for a while. I don't want to put too many words into his mouth, but he's pretty clear that he doesn't so much appreciate all of the what he calls the acronyms that are now floating around our field. And we are an acronym NARM, and so I don't know exactly why he didn't want to come on, but I kind of put a few pieces together and made a hypothesis that he thought we were just another one of these brands that was actually kind of teaching older models from a new branding perspective. And there is truth to that. I mean, all of the current models, IFS, EMDR, all of the current models that are very popular do have roots, in forms of psychotherapy that have been around for a long time, and not just Western psychotherapy, but often they don't give full due to some of the non-Western approaches that they've borrowed from. So, there is some good reason for that. But anyways, the fact that he finally said yes after so many, I'm very persistent. So after all these attempts to get him on, and then, I kind of wanted to have that conversation with him, but it ended up that you had that conversation with him. And I think it was great because I got to just be there as a listener. And we were joking before we started that he's been really promoting that episode a lot because he felt so good about it. He felt good about your connection. And he called it recently his favorite podcast that he's ever done. So not only did we get such a huge win for our community, but also he walked away feeling really happy about that experience. So what was that like for you?
Oh, it was so cool. I mean, I was boning up to, like to research before, looking at all of his work and hoping that I could, kind of call forth what he wanted to say, really. I didn't want to focus on really anything specific. I was just hoping he would bring whatever felt relevant, and it was exciting. It was really cool to connect with him on all of those pieces.
Hmm.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if this was this year or last year. You might remember, but Nancy McWilliams, was that this year?
I was thinking that
Uh,
was last year. Let me
Might have
look
been
at the
okay.
list.
Anyway, she was another dream guest. Maybe it was last year, but she was another one. She's not that popular outside of psychology, the field of psychology, but within psychology, her book is another book that many grad school programs require or deliver. And I've been inspired by her work for a long time. And it was just so cool to kind of hear you and her having this conversation. One of the things that I really have valued from her is the way that she's mentored thousands and thousands of psychotherapists over the years. And again, she comes from more of a depth oriented model. Her and Jonathan Shedler, I believe, have actually collaborated together in some of their writing. I'm actually right now reading one of her books on supervision that she came out with during the pandemic. And I take a lot of the way that I do consultation in the NARM work from some of her teachings. So that was another great episode, whether that was last year or this year.
It was episode 77, so everyone should go check that one
Oh,
out. I was just
oh,
checking it
wow.
out.
That was a while ago then. Okay.
Yeah, but
Um,
memorable for sure.
Yeah. The other really big name that we had of again was Gabor Mate, and he was also a dream guest. This was our second time we've had him, and first time I think him and Larry were talking, him and Dr. Heller, and this time you had your own conversation with him. And what was that like? How did that impact you?
Yeah, it was exciting. I mean, anyone who's heard very many interviews with Gabor knows that he really includes the interview. It's not me just like outside asking questions. He gets personal. So I knew
Yeah.
that in advance and tried to prepare myself a little bit for that. But it was a really cool moment to join him in that because he did
Mhm.
get personal and it felt very personal to me, but it was great.
Yeah. Again, another huge advocate for trauma informed work, all the books he's done and the advocacy he's done. And not to mention that he also promoted our book that we came out with last year. And so he's been and I believe Larry told me recently that they're doing some work together. So that'll be great too if they end up bringing compassionate inquiry and NARM together. I always like when these different models come together and collaborate instead of compete with each other. So I hope that happens.
Yeah. Yeah. Very cool.
One last I just wanted to mention in terms of like the kind of big names, quote unquote, because I also wanted to get Chloe Valdary
Mhm.
on for a long time. I've been following her work for several years. And, as I've done a lot of research over the years around DEI and DIB, diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, I was always trying to find models. There was so many great pieces of all these different models, but I didn't find a model that really kind of felt very trauma informed and also kind of had a certain spirit that feels similar to what we do in NARM. And when I came across Chloe's work, I was like, oh, yeah, this is it. And so I reached out to her. We got all of our staff trained and we did some training with our training assistants around her work. Her work's called The Theory of Enchantment. And so it's really infused now into the NARM trainings, into our staff, and having her on was just a great opportunity. We had never actually had a one-on-one conversation. I think I had been communicating all these years with one of her assistants or one of her staff members. And so having the chance to sit down and have these conversations with her was very exciting for me. And I hope that we'll have some future collaborations.
Yeah, and for any folks that wanna go back and listen to that episode, it was our 100th episode having her on, and I agree, like, that conversation was just really another impactful one for me, so
So what else kind of stood out or jumped out for you this year?
I really loved hearing from Larry and Diane.
Hmm.
Larry and Diane Poole Heller had a conversation about spirituality, and that I feel like that's kinda missing in a lot
Hmm.
of the work out there, and so I really appreciated hearing them both talk about that.
Hmm.
Let's see, what else? Philip Tedeschi?
Hmm.
How did you connect with him again? I can't remember the connection there.
Oh, I don't recall in this moment. Maybe I listened to a podcast with him. So I listened to a lot of podcasts. And, I think as I said before, I'm interested in the work around animals, both for assisting with humans, but also supporting animals. And I think that's the focus of his work.
Mhm.
And so I thought he would be a really interesting guest because we haven't had someone like that on before.
Yeah, that was a cool interestingly enough, my cats kept wanting to come and join us. They couldn't stay away. They, like, felt the energy or something. That was cool. And I named it, and he was like, "Yeah, that's not uncommon."
Oh, it's interesting. Like, yeah, the animal whisperer or something that people
Yeah.
want to.
Yeah, there was something there. That was pretty cool. Looking at the list, who else? Amanda Huffman, that was another one, hearing about the work that she's doing.
I would say out of all of the episodes this year, that one surprised me the most.
Oh, what surprised you?
Yeah, because I've known Amanda for a long time. I think we met in the somatic experiencing training community, and then she came and trained with me in NARM, and then she's been a training assistant with us. And I knew that she had moved back to her home state and was building a kind of a somatic retreat center where she's going to do direct work based in nature, having an organic farm and things like this and animals. But I didn't know of all of her like more recent focus into the what was the words she was using? I can't even remember the intestinal
Yeah.
like flora. I can't remember the name of
Yeah.
it.
Yeah, she really was passionate about that, and I hadn't made that connection either. So that was cool.
Yeah, because I've always known about like the enteric nervous system, and like sometimes they call the digestive system the second brain. There's
Right.
a lot of neurochemicals that are associated with it. There's a lot of research about serotonin in the
Hmm.
intestines, and so I knew some of the overarching understanding about gut health and related to trauma, related to depression and other mental illness. Yeah, but she went into such specifics around it that it was really cool because I just wasn't anticipating that that was where she was going. So
Hmm.
that was really fun to like learn all this new stuff from her. And, I've known her for a long time and I just didn't know most of that stuff. We've never had that conversation.
Yeah. So she was episode 98 and Philip Tedeschi is 99. So we're just kind of going down the list.
Yeah, a couple more that were kind of within our NARM community that really stood out for me were the one with Adam Angel.
Hmm.
Being a father of two boys myself, I was touched by the work he's doing with fathers, well, with parents, but specifically with fathers. And I appreciated the energy between you two in that conversation, both of you being parents who have had your own real experiences with your children and with your families. And I really appreciated the quality of your conversation and connection in addition to the great work that he's doing.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And then I got to meet him at the master's training. So it was neat to have that connection with him and then to meet him
Mm,
in person. And we had a conversation that it felt nice and supportive around that episode too.
mm. What else did that bring up for you in terms of just like parenting and
Yeah, really, just the heartfulness of the work that he's doing, and I felt so much appreciation for the support that he's giving fathers, both just in parenting and then also in loss. So if you haven't heard that episode, go back and listen to it because I think that I'm not sure how to talk about this really, but just that it's just not existent in a lot of spaces, this support for fathers who have lost and again in parenting too. But I think there's
mm,
something really special about that work that he's doing. So
mm.
yeah.
And then another interesting episode with Peter Monson about his
Mhm.
experiences in the military and growing up, in a fundamentalist kind of religious
Yeah.
background.
High demand religion. Yeah.
Yeah. And again, you had a really interesting conversation with him. Anything stands out for you about that conversation?
Yeah, I honestly, I'd have to listen to it again to remember exactly, but
Mm,
something that I am thinking about right now in this moment is actually the humor that he's able to
mm,
have. I feel like those topics can get really heavy, and actually we had some like light moments and that to me feels there's something about that that feels really important is like coming out the other side and like finding the lightness. And also he talked about I'm actually trying to remember if we talked about this after we stopped recording or in the conversation, but he talked a bit about how humor and lightness has really informed a lot of the healing because those things can feel really heavy and,
mm.
that was really what I came away with.
Yeah. I don't remember how much he talked about this on the episode, but he was in one of my trainings and just it was so interesting to because he wasn't just in the military, he was a interrogator. So he was part of the teams that would, capture,
Mhm.
people from who they were in conflict with and it was so interesting learning about how he talked about using his kind of trauma patterns for his work and so there's like a better and worse. Of course, there's worse because it just kept him in such hypervigilance. The better was that it made him really effective at his
Yeah.
work, which then I started to think about like all of the police officers and the first responders, the firefighters, that's a similar experience that they're hypervigilance EMTs, that they have to be on and that makes them very successful at their work, but it also has such consequences. And I'd like to make sure that we get more folks, in the future that can talk more about that because we have in the past had a few people talking about working with first responders, but I just think that there's a lot of, it's not just shock trauma, but there's a lot of complex trauma for folks that go into this profession. And then the shock traumas that they experience and just the general lifestyle then creates a lot of problems for their family and for themselves and addiction and domestic violence, suicide. I mean, these are all realities for so many people. So, again, I just like learning from people. And I learned a lot, I think, from meeting him in person and also listening to that episode.
Yeah, that was a good one.
Another one that's kind of in a strange way related was Monty Powell.
Mhm.
Monty, who you also met in
Yeah.
the master's training
Yeah.
recently. She's specializing in working with psychedelics. And this is a huge movement in the trauma informed field over the last 5 or 10 years. And many people are still learning a lot about this. I mean, the field is very new. I think she said several times in her interview that it's like the wild, wild west right now.
Hmm.
And, people ask me as a NARM teacher or as a teacher on complex trauma, like all the time now, like almost every time I teach, there's a question about psychedelics. It's very interesting. And, I don't feel like I have enough knowledge to make an opinion. And it was cool just hearing how open she was. It's like the more she's learning, the more open she's getting around it because
Hmm.
there's no one right answer. It's very complex. It's, the medicine, as they call it, is very strong, and there's many different ways that it gets delivered. And again, there's very little regulation at this point. Most of it's still illegal, and there's all sorts of different psychedelics and psychoactive medications that are or medicines that are being used. So I think there's going to be a lot more focus in the next 5-10 years on this, and I'm looking forward to more conversations with her and other people because our clients are going to be coming in either interested or having done experiences already. And I think it's really important for us as trauma therapists to just at least have some baseline knowledge and understanding of it.
Right, right. And that episode was actually leading into she did a webinar with you, right?
Yes.
So folks can find that if they're interested in learning more about that. There's a webinar on the website.
Yeah, I thought she did a great job because you can get into the weeds pretty quickly with all the different chemicals that are being used and how it affects the brain and the nervous system and the psychology. And I thought she did a good job giving enough detail so that you could walk away and kind of have a clear understanding, but not so much that it got overwhelming in that
Mhm.
webinar. And the hope is that we'll do some future follow-up webinars. But yeah, I'd encourage people to take a look at that for sure.
Cool. And before Monty, there was Albert Wong,
Mm.
and he was another one that just talking to him was really sweet. I mean, I don't he just has a way about him that was really, really special. So he was one of the earlier ones at the beginning of this year. I don't know if anything stuck out to you about that conversation.
Well, I appreciate his work. He wasn't the founder, but he led the somatic program at JFK University
Mhm.
in the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area. And I know a bunch of clinicians that went through that program. I'm not sure if it still exists or not. I don't
I
recall.
don't think it is. Yeah, they closed
Yeah.
down.
Yeah. So, anyways, I met him back then. And yeah, I know people were very impacted by his leadership and the impact that he had on many, many students that were graduating and getting introduced to somatic therapy. So, I always enjoy having people. That's my background in somatic therapy. We had Stephen Gilligan. No,
Mhm.
I'm sorry. Well, we did have Stephen Gilligan, but we had,
Dan Schiff?
yes, Dan Schiff, thank you very much. Yeah, I really appreciate that conversation. He reminded me a lot of my old mentor, who I hope to have on at some point too, Peter Collins.
Mhm.
And they, these were guys that in the 60s and 70s were young therapists who were being introduced to, back then, psychotherapy, at least somatic psychotherapy, was kind of the wild, wild west.
Mhm.
Larry was part of that. Larry and Diane and Peter Levine, and a lot of folks, Pat Ogden, a lot of folks that now we know as kind of founders of some of these models. And I liked his perspective because he's been in the field a long time. He's seen a lot of things. And again, I appreciated kind of his integrative. That's how my mind is too. I like to integrate things. And he seemed to have, he wasn't about one or other camps. He was really about integration. So that was a fun episode. Whenever I can talk about Wilhelm Reich and somatic therapy, I get excited. So that
Yeah.
was fun too.
Yeah. Another one that jumps out at me was Galen Elmore.
Yeah.
He's a former NFL player and has a really interesting background.
I really enjoyed that episode a lot. Yeah, I was thinking about him before when we were talking because that's another example of people I'd like to get on more, is people that have, made really significant shifts in their life. I mean, I'm sure if you would have asked him 5-10 years ago if you'd be, doing the work that
Mhm.
he's doing now, he would have never said yes. And also just how forthright and open and vulnerable he was about his upbringing. Yeah, ended up becoming an NFL football player.
Yeah, I was curious how you came in contact with him.
Well, I'm a sports fan, although I never knew of him. I don't remember that name, but I think I probably was reading an email or something that was about him presenting at an organization or something. And I got interested. And then I usually go down a rabbit hole. As I was reading about him, I was thinking, like, well, this is different. We've never had someone like this on our podcast that was a
Yeah.
professional athlete that then is doing this really incredible trauma-informed work. Yeah, and it's funny, you just never know how people are going to respond. Some people just never respond. And he was so kind and excited about the invitation. And I felt like he brought that energy into your conversation. And that makes me really happy, because I can tell sometimes people are just doing it to do it, or sometimes they're just doing it because they're kind of promoting something. But just wanting to spread the word and share his story to help hopefully impact people, because he was one of those kids that needed someone's voice
Mm.
that he didn't get until way late. And so that's kind of how I see myself in a certain way. And so I enjoyed his energy in your conversation a lot with him.
Yeah, he was really sweet and genuine, and his work on belonging is I'm excited that more people are becoming aware of what he's doing.
Yeah. Anything like personally, like jump out for you in any of your conversations this year?
Well, I'll just say this. I mean, this it did impact me personally, but the one with you and Michael Nickenshuk, am I saying his name
Mm,
right?
yep.
I feel like that's really relevant,
Mm,
especially right now with everything going on in the world. That was a really interesting conversation to listen to. In fact, I've just been thinking I want to go back and listen to it, but
mm.
he brought a lot of things forward that I think are important for right now.
Yeah. I remember my story of finding him. He
Yeah.
spoke at a conference after Larry. They were at a trauma conference in Boston that Bessel van der Kolk organizes, and I couldn't attend. So I was watching it on stream, either live or by video, or later. I can't remember. But I watched the whole day, and he came on after Larry, and his work reminded me very much of the work that I did before I became a licensed psychotherapist. I worked in Asia with Burmese refugees, and his kind of orientation was very similar to mine. I mean, even the title of his book, which I can't remember now exactly, but were like thoughts that I had had about writing a book about
Mm.
my experiences in working in humanitarian aid. We shared a very similar perspective. And so, yeah, it was very cool. The difference is that he worked primarily with Muslim folks in the Middle East, which, yes, of course, right now is very timely. And I appreciate anyone that works in that field that brings what we call subjectification, which is the opposite of objectification, and humanization, because even very well intended humanitarian workers can look at the people that they're working with through the lens of numbers and dollar signs and things like this, and lose sight of every human being's story in life that got them there. And there is a reason why people don't hold it that way, because it's overwhelming.
Mhm.
And I've shared a little bit on this podcast my experiences. I mean, I came into graduate school because I got completely overwhelmed by being a humanitarian aid worker. I didn't have the capacity to deal with the human beings and the situation that I was dealing with for the long term, at least. So I just have a huge place in my heart for people that are doing that work, and they need a lot of support. It's very underfunded. And as he talked about, mental health is often just looked at very down. Usually they focus on education or, of course, healthcare, but mental health is not prioritized. And then in many societies, mental health is generally, you know, supported through the family and the family system, and not fully trusted outside the family system. So,
Right.
yeah, again, I just appreciate people that are doing this kind of work in ways that are really new and different. And I think that that's what he's really trying to do. So I also enjoyed that conversation a lot.
Mhm. Yeah. You asked what personally really impacted me, and again, all of them have, but I think that the conversation with Jack O'Keefe was also
Mm,
one that felt really important. I think a lot of people in my life are stepping away from organized religion and really understanding, multiple perspectives around that. I think that she's got a really important message, and in her work with I can't remember how she talked about it, so I don't want to put words in her mouth, but working with leaders in spiritual
yeah.
communities and making sure that how they're doing it is ethical, basically, is kind of the my version of how to talk about it. I don't know if anything jumped out at you about that conversation.
Yeah, I think the phrase might have been spiritual integrity. Is that the word,
Ah, yeah,
the phrase? Yeah.
that feels right.
Yeah, I think that might be her nonprofit that she created. Yeah, yeah, I mean, I have a lot of thoughts on that. Maybe we can have another conversation
Mhm.
about that, because the intersection of, sexual, well, that's interesting I said sexual, because I meant to say religious, but religious and
But
sexual trauma often
yeah.
do intersect as well. Yeah, so I have a lot of curiosity and interest and experience working with folks that have had religious trauma. And I always appreciate guests that talk about that, both from a professional and personal
Mhm.
perspective. And I thought, she's been in the field and very passionate. I really took away how passionate she is to try to bring greater integrity and greater trauma-informed principles to some of these spiritual and religious communities.
Yeah, I felt that conversation and Peter Monson's conversation, I feel like there was some related pieces there. So, but yeah, that one really felt personal to me. And then as well as Dr. Sarah Rappaport.
Mm.
She's a naturopathic doctor, is that
Yep.
right? And that was kind of timely for me as I'm like navigating some health things. And so
Mhm.
having that conversation, in the past I've had kind of some distrust with with medical providers due to some experiences that I've had. And so having that conversation felt really important for me, just remembering our agency and our options and our choices. Yeah, she's doing good work.
Another person you got to meet
Yes,
recently.
another person I got to meet. So many and yeah, that was cool.
Well, I was thinking like the two last ones that I was reflecting on that were more personally impactful for me were Tina Sachs. She was earlier in this year, and she is a biracial person. She's half Black, half African American, and half Jewish, and really focusing on cultural belonging. I was introduced to her work somehow and started kind of, devouring what I could find about it. And I just really felt a very strong kind of kinship connection about her experiences, both her personal experiences that she shared growing up with her identity confusion and living in a culture and a country that didn't accurately reflect back to her how she felt about herself or who she wanted to be, and then just navigating all the different challenges, and then the professional work that's kind of followed her personal work. And again, I just found a lot of resonance with her experience, and I just enjoyed connecting with her a lot. So that had a pretty big personal impact on me, that conversation.
Yeah, I felt she brought a really interesting perspective that I haven't been in contact with very much. So I learned a lot listening to that.
And then the last one, which you said you hadn't listened to yet, so I hope you'll
Yeah.
listen to at some point, is just a friend of mine, an old friend of mine. We've been friends almost 20 years. Twig is what he goes by. And Twig is a pretty amazing storyteller and what he calls cultural animist. He has traveled around the world and he's trained as a somatic therapist and has really kind of made his name as a teacher and as a storyteller, although I think he still does direct work too. And he's done a lot of writing. He comes from the somatic experiencing community. So he's a somatic experiencing practitioner. And we were part of many different trainings and experiences through the somatic experiencing training community. And we used to try to connect at least once a year, usually around the holidays at the end of the year. And so we decided to make it our podcast this time because our conversations tend to be like, we haven't talked in a year. We'll trade
Mm,
emails throughout the year, but we haven't really talked. And then our conversation will be like these 2 or 3 hour, like amazing
mm.
conversations. And so I was like, let's capture this and see
That's
how it
cool.
goes. And of course we were both probably a little self-conscious that we were recording it, but it was just fun, because, he's a dear person to me and he's done some amazing work. And it was fun to kind of share some of he's a very unique perspective on things in the way he presents. So it was fun to kind of share some of his perspective and his work with our community.
Fantastic. I also just have to say, change of subject,
Mhm.
but we did an episode presenting the new master's training. And I imagine we'll talk more about that in a future episode. But that the whole experience of the master's level 3 training was really impactful for me. So that conversation got me really excited to get started.
Wow, that would be so cool to go back and listen to it because I think when we recorded it, I wasn't even done with the
You
curriculum
weren't.
yet.
No, you weren't.
Yeah.
But it got me
And
excited. You did a good
oh,
job
wow.
gearing us
Thank
all up.
you. I mean, it's been for me personally, just been a highlight of my career to put together that training. And, thank you for being you were part of my first
Mhm.
master's training group. And it was just such a beautiful experience. And I can't wait, to next year again, already to be back with our community and continue to refine the material and deepen it. So yeah, that would be fun to go back and listen to that.
Yeah. Yeah, you should. I rarely say you should, but you should.
Yeah, yeah, I will. So I had two questions for you as we kind of start wrapping
Yeah.
up here. Is one is what's like just a learning for you, like in all these conversations,
Mm.
like what do you feel like you're taking away from just generally from this experience for yourself and any learning in it?
Oh, so much. I was thinking about this morning, and I think the biggest thing, the most impactful thing for me is I feel like every single guest, there was so much humility, I'm sitting having these conversations with like experts, I would say they're like, they know their stuff.
Mhm.
But there was so much humility. And that just reminded me, I don't have to have all the answers with my clients, in any sort of training capacity. I don't need to have the answers. And that there's so much freedom that comes with that, and helps me relieve, the self-pressuring. I don't need to have all the answers. So that, I think that was just a common theme that I felt with most every conversation, is the humility and the openness to always be learning. That
Mhm.
feels really good.
Mm. I love that. Yeah, I think that's true. I think, the people that have come on have been very open and very generous, and just, again, they don't have to be on with us. And
Hmm.
I really appreciate them sharing their experiences and also some of the failures and some of the challenges
Right.
that I mean, as we talk about in the NARM work, that sometimes our quote failures there's so much information in them and they can be our greatest learning. So
Yeah.
that's cool.
Yeah. How about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's connected to it. I think the thing that I was saying before, part of what gets related to trauma is helplessness, and the world is a mess. The world it's people are really, really suffering, and it's hard to compare is it more or less than it was 30 or 80 years ago? I don't know, but I just know now that there's 8 billion people on the planet, and humans are suffering, communities are suffering, countries are suffering, the planet's suffering. And I just feel inspired or in awe that these people wake up every day despite all of their personal and collective suffering, and they don't allow themselves to get lost in all of the reactivity and all of the strategies, and just really stay focused on bringing their heart's desire, as we might say in NARM, into the world. And sometimes it's not so easy.
Yeah.
It goes against a lot of things. We talked about some of these big name folks. I mean, Judith Herman and Gabor Mate. I mean, Jonathan Shedler, Chloe Valdry, they're going against a lot of different strong forces. It's much easier to just kind of give it up and just go with status quo. And I just really respect that. I find a lot of inspiration from it. And on the days that it's harder for me to kind of carry the things that I'm carrying, it brings me hope to know that I can go back and listen to
Yeah.
some of these folks and just find the hopefulness and find the heartfulness in, they're just doing this work because they care and they want to make the world a better place, and can't control how people receive it. But to me, that's very inspiring and resonant for me.
Yeah. I love that.
And then my last question is just like in terms of moving into next year for 2024, specifically with the podcast, like, is there anything that you're dreaming of or would like to see or have any intentions?
I hadn't thought about that. And I don't know who we have slated for next year. Last year, I feel like I knew some of the names that were coming up, that I'm just really excited. And I mean, one thing I'm learning is that every single guest, I walk away and I just feel so much gratitude. I mean, right along with what you were saying, but just like, oh, there's so many good people in the world. That's cool to remember that all these folks are doing their work in their circle of influence, and they're changing the world in their sphere, and I can do that too. I can, with whatever capacity I have, I get excited about that. So whoever we have on, I'm really excited to meet new
Mm-hmm.
people and hear all the new voices, new to me
Mm-hmm.
voices.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Emily, we've just been so appreciative. I've gotten a lot of feedback from not just one or two guests, but from many guests about how much they've really appreciated you as a host and made it comfortable, and your kindness and your heart, your warmth, your care. And it's just, again, capturing the spirit of what we're doing in NARM. And so thank you so much. And I look very much forward to surprising you next time with all these guests
Yay.
that you don't know about yet.
I love it. Yeah,
Mm.
thank you. Such kind words. And it feels good to feel seen, and that my intentions are, people are feeling my intention. I want it to be just a warm conversation, and I'm glad to hear that people are feeling that way.
Yeah. All right. Well, I look forward to talking to you in 2024. Thanks so much.
Sounds good. Thanks, Brad.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for joining us for today's episode. To find more about our guest and their work, check the show notes or visit us at narmtraining.com/transformingtrauma. Are you working with clients or populations dealing with the effects of adverse childhood experiences and complex trauma? If so, we invite you to consider joining us to become trained in the neuroaffective relational model in support of trauma-informed care. We are excited to offer psychoeducational and clinical trainings for a variety of mental health professionals. For more information on these NARM trainings and to apply, please visit www.narmtraining.com/schedule. Thanks to Andrea Klunder and the Creative Imposter Studios for producing and editing, to Tori Essex for our album art, and to Brad Kammer for the creation of this podcast. We look forward to building community, connection with you, and changing the world by transforming trauma.